Conditions May Apply by CinnamonPinecones. Read by Distracted by Books. Chapter 75, Swan Dive. Ivy and Eraser had yet to encounter any more gang members around town. It seemed like the message that they were not to be messed with had been well communicated. Every few days, Eraser would tell them that another person had been caught a few cities over, but eventually those reports started to peter out. At the end of the day, the threat was neutralized, and they tried not to let the few stragglers bother them. Despite everything falling into place, Izuku still couldn't sleep through the night. He used to get a full night's rest, if not more, whenever he and Eraser took a break night, but ever since he found DJ, he hadn't slept more than a few hours at a time, and that was almost 2 months ago at this point. Some nights, he was able to accept that he might never sleep soundly again, but other nights he woke up screaming and it just made him angry. Tonight was one of those nights. It wasn't even about DJ usually. He dreamed of fire and gunshots and bloodied, shattered corpses on the pavement. Those were the dreams he woke up screaming from. But sometimes he would dream of DJ or the Shinsos, and he'd wake up already crying. Even if it was a good dream, it just reminded him of what he lost. He was so tired of being tired. He was tired of going through the motions. He was tired of not being happy. He finally did it. The gang was gone. The last remaining members spread to the wind, but he wasn't happy. He was glad it was over. He was proud to have done what he'd done, but the feeling was hollow and flimsy, and it hung limply against the solid, crushing weight of his grief and loneliness. He woke up screaming and angry, but he was too tired to feel it properly, so it melted into sadness. He laid there, staring up at the ceiling for hours, until his alarm went off. He was tired of going to school. It felt so trivial compared to everything else in his life. But if he didn't go, he didn't eat and didn't shower. So every day he scraped himself up off the couch and dragged himself to class. Izuku was considering buying concealer because he was even more tired of everyone telling him how tired he looked. "When's the last time you slept? You look like shit. You look like a zombie." They were as utterly uncreative as most of the insults slung at him, but he was already tired and tired of being tired. Adding tired of being made fun of for looking tired was another layer of salt on the wound that he didn't need. The start of the new school year didn't make anything better. In fact, it felt a bit worse to have seniority over the majority of the school and still be at the bottom of the pecking order. It hit different to be bullied by someone 2 years your junior. He made it to class without any major incidents and took his seat just before the bell rang. He spent half the morning picking at the splintered wood of his desk, marred from years of explosions and slurs carved into the surface. There were no more profiles to work on, no more evidence to sort through, and no more plans to coordinate. He felt a bit lost after having spent the last few months in the thick of it. After a while of passively listening and taking notes, he pulled out his hero analysis book. He hadn't touched it since DJ died. It, like many other things, seemed far too trivial to devote his time to after that. Now that he felt like he had all the time in the world, he figured he might as well pick up where he left off. Izuku spent the rest of morning classes as well as lunch scrawling in his journal. It felt good to come back to it. It felt familiar. When afternoon classes started, he dimly registered that his teacher was talking about prospective high schools and applications, but Izuku had already turned in all the things he needed in order to get the process started, so he ignored the lecture for the most part. It was a bit more difficult to ignore when Kachan started ranting loudly about UA and some self-congratulatory bullshit, but he tried his best. Everyone knew Kachan was going to UA. He didn't need to make a scene about it. Izuku had become quite skilled at tuning out his rants over the last decade, so he barely heard a word of it, but his teacher's words pulled him right back to the present. "Oh yeah, Midoriya, don't you want to go to UA too?" he asked with a smirk. If he could crawl into himself and disappear, he would do it in a heartbeat. The entire class burst out into laughter. "Listen up, Deku. You're even worse than the rest of these damn rejects, you quirkless wannabe. You really think they'd let someone like you in when they could have me?" Katsuki bellowed as he let off an explosion on Izuku's desk, sending him sprawling back out of his seat and onto the floor. "I'm not trying to compete with you, Kacha. You'd never be able to hang with the best of the best. You'd die in the exams. Defenseless Deku. This school's already crappy. Do you really want to embarrass it more by failing so hard?" he sneered. The teacher finally decided to reel things in at that point. "Boys, back in your seats," he chastised, like Izuku left his seat intentionally. The rest of class dragged by, and Izuku tried to make a break for it the moment the bell rang, like usual. But Kachan grabbed him by the collar and dragged him back away from the door before he could book it. It had been a while since anyone gave him a proper beatdown. He'd been getting too good at evading, but Izuku got the feeling this was going to end far worse for him if he didn't cooperate, so he let himself be dragged back into the classroom. "I don't know what you think you're doing, Deku, but we're not done." Kachan sneered as he shoved him backward and grabbed the notebook out of his hand. "What you got? His diary?" One of Kachan's goons teased. "Ha! Don't tell me you're taking notes on how to be a hero," he scoffed after reading the front cover. "That's so pathetic," the other crony chimed in. "Yeah, he's delusional." "It's real funny, guys. Just give it back," he grumbled out, doing his best to maintain his composure. It wouldn't do him any good to retaliate. Before he could get the chance to grab it, Kachan put a hand on either side and let off an explosion, charring the book pretty badly before throwing it out the window. Izuku felt something in him snap at that, but he was so tired. He was so freaking tired. Not for the first time he had the urge to kick Katsuki's ass, but he had to remind himself that that wouldn't end well. Even if he didn't get his own ass beat in the process, there would be consequences. Consequences he couldn't afford to pay. So instead, he took a deep breath. Most first-rate heroes show potential early on. People look at them and just know that they're destined for greatness. When I'm the only student from this garbage junior high to make it into UA, people will start talking about me like that. They'll realize I'm legit. The next big thing. That's not ego talking. I just know I'm good. His goons snickered and poked fun at his ego as Katsuki stepped forward and rested a hand on his shoulder that immediately started smoldering. He could feel the cheap polyester melting against his skin, but he kept a scowl on his face, not giving him the satisfaction of seeing him flinch. "Here's a little word of advice, nerd. Don't even think of applying, or else," he cooed with faux cheer in his tone. Kachan jerked his hand off his shoulder painfully and walked away after that. Izuku just stood there seething silently. Distantly, he heard them continue to mock him, but he did his best to ignore it. Even still, Kachan's words cut through the dissonance. "You know, if you really want to be a hero that badly, there might actually be another way. Just pray that you'll be born with a quirk in your next life and take a swan dive off the roof of the building." The words hit him like a ton of bricks. He was glad his back was turned to Kachan because he wasn't sure he was able to keep the shock off his face. Izuku listened as footsteps made their way to the door and down the hall, followed by snickers and laughter. He stood there, frozen, until any sounds they made were well out of earshot. Eventually, he mustered up the motivation to sling his bag over his shoulder and walk out of the room on stiff legs. Once he got outside, Izuku walked up to the koi pond to see fish nibbling at the soaked and charred remains of his notebook. It felt childish to care about the book. It felt childish to care about anything Kacchan said, but still, he felt his eyes go misty. It was far from the first time someone had told him to kill himself, but it was the first time Kacchan dared to utter the words. For some reason, Izuku had never thought he would, that he would never stoop so low. Maybe he was just clinging on to the hope that Kacchan still gave a shit about him, that he would still care if he lived or died. Apparently not. Why did it hurt so much? Why would he ever think that Kacchan cared? He was an a-hole. He never did anything to make Izuku think he might still care. He didn't even realize he'd been holding on to the hope that he did until he said that and shattered that hope to pieces. What was the use of hope? It always broke. It always left him broken. He was doing well. Things were looking up. Why the hell did he still let Kacchan have the power to ruin that? Izuku had been walking around aimlessly, trying to forget those words, but he was just getting more and more lost in his own head. He wasn't so lost that he didn't hear the awful, gooping, sloshing sound of sludge leaking up out of the grates of the sewer behind him. Whipping himself around to face it, he saw a dark green blob of a creature start to take form, rising from the manhole. "You'll make a perfect skin suit to hide in, kid," the slopping mass said in a deep, scratchy voice. Freaking phenomenal! Just what he needed. They took up a fighting stance as the man sloshed toward them. They dodged out of the way for the first few attacks, but the guy was completely fluid and they couldn't predict his movements. Eventually, they were ensnared in a cold, viscous goop that immediately tried to shove itself down their throat. "You're quick, aren't you? Don't worry, I'm just taking over your body. It'll be easier for both of us if you don't fight back. It'll only hurt for a minute. You'll feel better soon," the man teased. Oh, they would have a few choice words for this prick if they weren't currently being smothered. The man's form was forcing their mouth open and slithering into their nasal passages, leaving an awful burning sensation in its wake. No amount of coughing helped, and they kept clawing at the man to no avail. "Grab all you want. My body's made of wood. Thanks for the help. You're a real hero to me," he taunted again. Made of fluid? How did that work? He couldn't be completely fluid, could he? He had to have a weak point, something they could exploit. They thought about how the man flowed up and out of the sewer, how his eyes and teeth floated in the awful soup that was the rest of his body. Those two things were the only part of him that looked any different from the rest. Maybe they were solid. Maybe they weren't. But they were running out of options quickly, so they grabbed blindly toward where the voice emanated and clawed until they felt something solid. The moment they made contact with what they assumed to be an eye, given how squishy it felt, they heard the sewer cap hit the bottom of the bridge above them. Shit, that better not be backup for this a-hole. Their vision was going spotty, and they were starting to panic. They couldn't take on anyone else right now. "Have no fear, you're safe, for I am here." All Might? What the frick? Never mind. Thank heavens, they really didn't want to learn what the sensation of an eyeball popping in the palm of your hand felt like, and they're sure the goop guy didn't either. The theatric Texas Smash was music to their ears as the villain's liquid body blew away in the strong winds All Might shot toward them like water under a hand dryer. Unfortunately, it also blew them back onto their ass, causing them to smack their head on the concrete. He wasn't sure whether he'd passed out or not, but he definitely saw stars, and when his vision cleared, All Might was looking down at him and lightly smacking his face. Okay, yeah, he probably passed out. He sat up quickly and looked around for his attacker, but the coast looked clear, and All Might didn't look overly concerned. Not that he would even know what All Might looked like when he was overly concerned, but he doubted that the sludge villain was too much for All Might to handle. Ah, thought we lost you there, All Might cheered as he settled his focus back on him. Well, looks like you're moving around all right. Sorry about that back there. I didn't mean to get you caught up in my justicing. Usually I pay more attention to keeping bystanders safe, but it turns out this city's sewer system is pretty difficult to navigate, he explained with a laugh. Izuku would admit that he was a bit starstruck. He had looked up to All Might as a little kid. He was the #1 hero. He was entitled to a bit of gawking. Anyway, you were a big help. Thank you. I've captured the evildoer, he exclaimed as he held up two 2-liter bottles filled with dirty green goop. Izuku was fumbling over himself, not really forming a proper sentence. Kami, was the concussion that bad? Or was he just that hopelessly awkward? Well, I gotta get this guy to the police so they can take care of him. Stay out of trouble. See you around. Wait, he wasn't gonna check him for a concussion? Was someone else on the way? Shit, he had to get out of here. But he had questions. He needed to know how long he was out for, and, well, selfishly, he wanted some reassurance, too. It'd been a shit day, okay? Wait, Now stand back. I'm taking off. Thanks for your continued support, he shouted. Everything happened too fast. Izuku didn't even realize he'd grabbed onto All Might before they were soaring above the city at Mach Zeus. He's not too proud to admit that he did let out an undignified screech. Hey, 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 what do you think you're doing? Let go. I love my fans, but this is too much, All Might declared as he gently tried to push him off. If I let go, I'll die, he shouted back. Oh, that's a good point, All Might conceded and shifted his hand from trying to push him off to holding him in place. After soaring above the city for a terrifying few seconds, they touched down on a random rooftop. Not a very smart move. Bang on the door for a while. Someone will let you in. Now I have to go. See you on the flip side. Wait 1 second. No, I don't have any time. I have to know. Is it possible to become a hero even if I don't have a quirk? He asked desperately as All Might walked away. He stopped when he asked that question. At first, Izuku thought he was actually going to answer, but then he noticed the hand clutching at his side and the slight hunch to his posture. Was he okay? Steam was starting to rise off his shoulders. All Might, are you okay? Suddenly, the steady rise of steam erupted into a plume, shrouding him completely, and Izuku could see the shadowed silhouette of his form deflate. When the smoke cleared, a skeleton of a man was standing where All Might had been. He looked sickly and malnourished. All Might's quirk had been a source of speculation on the internet for decades. Was it a transformation quirk? Why would he transform in front of Izuku? Did it have a time limit? If it was just a time limit, why was he clutching his side like he'd been injured? Was he actually hurt? Izuku was snapped out of his speculation when All Might started coughing up blood. Okay, nope, definitely hurt. Before Izuku even knew what he was doing, he'd run over to All Might and guided him to sit down. He whipped off his backpack and went to pull out his first aid kit before he could stop to think that there wasn't much a first aid kit could do for internal bleeding, and All Might was batting his hands away. It's fine. I'm fine, young man, he assured him in a much more dour tone than he used in his other form. You're coughing up blood. I'm not a doctor, but I wouldn't call that okay. You've got internal bleeding. Are your ribs all right? Do you have a punctured lung? No, don't get up, he instructed as he bossed All Might back into a seated position on the rooftop when he tried to stand. All Might grabbed both his hands in his own. completely enveloping them because his were so much bigger, even in this smaller form. Kid, it's fine. He dropped one of his hands to lift up the left side of his shirt. It's an old injury, he explained, and gestured to the gnarly scar that took up over half of his torso. The scar was a starburst centered on his left side with old surgical cuts leaving all the way up his pec and across his stomach. He didn't realize he was staring until All Might dropped his shirt again. Pretty gross, right? I got this in a fight 5 years back. I'm counting on you to keep your mouth shut. Don't go talking about this online or tell your friends. Izuku almost scoffed at that. He had no friends to tell, and he barely had access to the internet anyway. Even if he wanted to spill All Might's secret, no one would listen to him. My respiratory system was basically destroyed, and I lost my whole stomach. All the surgeries have pretty much worn me out. It can't be fixed. 5 years ago? Does that mean it was the fight with Toxic Chainsaw? He asked incredulously before he thought better of it. Wow, you know your stuff. But no, the punk may have landed some hits, but he couldn't bring me down. Most of the world has never heard of this fight. I did everything I could to keep it under wraps. His expression darkened even more as he continued, I'm supposed to be the guy who's always smiling, right? I'm the symbol of peace. People everywhere have to think that I'm never afraid, but honestly I smile to hide the fear inside. It's just a brave face I put on when the pressure is high. This job isn't easy. Pro heroes are always having to risk their lives. Some villains just can't be beaten without powers. So no, I honestly don't think you can be a hero without a quirk. Izuku's mind went from racing to completely still in a second. He'd forgotten he'd even asked that. He was too caught up in All Might's injury. He froze where he was, knelt down next to him as All Might stood to leave. If you want to help people, there are plenty of other ways to do it. Become a police officer. They get crap because heroes capture most of the villains, but it's a fine profession. It's not bad to have a dream, young man. Just make sure your dreams are attainable, realistic. Understand? He called over his shoulder as he left the roof, taking the stairs back down to street level. He barely heard him as he walked away. Did he really just say that? All Might? He just... Izuku was completely stunned, speechless. He was damn near stunned, thoughtless. His hand reached up to clutch at the railing on the ledge as he numbly hauled himself to his feet. He didn't get very far because the view in front of him caught his attention. He was looking down at the city, at the drop below him. That drop had been calling out to him for as long as he could remember, but right now it was screaming. His heart was racing and his hands were shaking as Kachan's words mixed with All Might's and echoed in his mind until he couldn't hear anything else. He couldn't hear his better judgment telling him that he had already saved so many people. He couldn't hear logic telling him that he was already a hero. And he couldn't hear Eraser's shaking, broken voice telling him to stick around for him, to call him if it ever got this bad again. He couldn't hear any of it. He couldn't say how long he was stuck there like that until an explosion pulled him out of his head. That sounded like Kachan. Another explosion rang out, and he was vaulting over the safety fence and scaling down the fire escapes before he could think twice. Kami, it was broad daylight on the nice side of town, and he wasn't in any sort of disguise. Apparently, today was the day for acting before thinking because he was already halfway down, and there was no point in going back now. He hit the ground running and gunned it for where the commotion was coming from. He didn't let himself stop to think about how there probably wasn't anything he could do. He just ran. End of chapter.